the senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is the Senate in a quorum call?
It is.
I'd ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the presiding officer for being here at this late hour, and for the staff that's here, the pages that are here, the others that are here late at night before the holidays. Thank you for being here and for your service. And I think we're coming to a point, maybe not tonight, but in the next 24 hours when we're going to conclude our business here for the moment, or at least temporarily conclude our business. I wanted to come to the floor because one of the things that I feel very strongly about that we have not yet done is to pass the Ukraine funding, which I think is essential for Ukraine, essential for our own national security, and essential for Western democracy. I really believe that. I think it is of that importance, and I believe we should have gotten to a bipartisan agreement on this long ago. I think that we should have gotten it through the House of Representatives long ago. But I'm not in charge of the Senate. I'm not in charge of the House of Representatives. I'm just one person in this body, like the presiding officer is, and sometimes democracy moves more slowly than one would like, certainly than I would like. I feel more optimistic today than I did last week about the prospects of our getting to a point where we have that bipartisan vote and where we can send a piece of legislation over to the House to fund this. The House is not going to start it. We know that because of the politics over there. This body is the body that needs to lead and has, I think, a moral responsibility to lead. But for all those reasons, I wanted to come here tonight and say that I was going to lift my hold on the FAA, which is something that I have held up through the course of these negotiations as a way of keeping us here, Mr. President, to be really honest with you. I don't think we would have come back, probably, from our departure last week if we didn't have the unfinished business of the FAA to do. And while the FAA is unrelated to the Ukraine funding, it was a must-pass bill, and it is a must-pass bill. We need to pass that bill. And it was something that could force us to come back here, to continue to have the debate, to continue to have the negotiation, to listen to each other on this important issue and the other issues that we've got to deal with this week, including the judges that we're confirming, hopefully a judge from Colorado. I've been out here before on the floor, Mr. President, to explain why I care so much about this. I was out here when we were passing what's called a continuing resolution here in, I think it was September, which is a temporary budget that's used to operate the federal government in the absence of what we should do, which is have a real budget. Sometimes we pass these things called continuing resolutions to kind of keep the lights on in this place, which I sometimes call the land of flickering lights, because the standard of success, you know, at the end of the year often is whether we've kept these lights flickering for another year. That's not the standard that I wish for our Congress. It's not a standard that I wish for our democracy or for our country. That's sometimes the standard here. But every now and then we surprise ourselves, and every now and then the people that have been in this chamber have taken on a responsibility for leadership that's really made a difference in the world, that's made a difference not just to our country, but to the entire world, and especially to the free world, to democracy. I've been out here and talked, I won't do it at length tonight, but talked about my mom's own circumstances. She's, well, I won't say how old she is today, but you can do the math. She was born in 1938 in Warsaw, Poland, born a Polish Jew in the worst possible moment in human history, to be born a Jew on this planet in the worst possible place a person could ask to be born, in a city that was going to shortly experience the horrific invasion of Nazi troops sent there by Adolf Hitler to exterminate the Jews of Europe and many other people that lived in Eastern Europe at that time. Just in Ukraine and Poland, at that time, there were 16 million people that were killed. They were killed by Hitler and killed by Stalin. And the people in that region remember that experience like it was yesterday, because it was, in human events, it was yesterday. My mom, as I said, is still alive. She can't believe that she's lived long enough to see another shooting war break out in Europe, as she put it, but here we are. And there's a reason why she can't believe it. I mean, part of it is that the freedom that she experienced and my grandparents experienced, and an aunt who was the only other person who survived the war in this country, were unimaginable to them because of what they had gone through in Warsaw. They were separated during the war. My mother was told that her parents had been killed, and she believed they had died. And then they were reunited after the war, and they went to Stockholm, Sweden for a year, after they spent about a year or two behind the Iron Curtain, because, of course, the Soviet Union had come in and taken over Poland after the war was over, and come in and taken over Warsaw after the war was over. Warsaw had been completely destroyed. More than 99% of its buildings were destroyed. Millions of people that lived in and around Warsaw had been killed. There was literally nothing left. It was rubble. It was rubble. And like many human beings that have experienced ethnic cleansing and ethnic battles like this, my mom and her parents probably never imagined that there could be a world where disputes could be resolved in some other way besides violence, besides political violence. And yet, after they stayed there for a couple of years, they realized that they wanted something better than what they had. So they went to Stockholm, Sweden for a year, and they lived there. They started their small business again, which was an art dealership that they had in Warsaw, a gallery. And then they moved to Mexico City. And then they were fortunate enough to be allowed to come to the United States of America, where they immigrated. My mother was the only person in the family who could speak any English. I think she was about 11 years old today. Even today, she speaks Swedish and Polish and Spanish and English. But then she was the only person in the family who could speak any English. She was the only person in her family that knew how to register herself in school. So she did. She registered herself in the New York City public schools. She graduated from Hunter College High School. I've never met anybody in my family or in my state. I met a lot of immigrants all throughout Colorado and all throughout this country. And I tell people sometimes, I still haven't met anybody that has a stronger accent than my grandparents had. They didn't think they had an accent, but they had this unbelievably strong Polish accent. And yet their joy at being Americans, not because this country was perfect, not because this country was exceptional in some sense that confers the idea of perfection, but because it was a country that could correct its imperfections without resorting to violence. And that they, as recent citizens to this country, as immigrants to this country, as people with the strong accents and their Jewish heritage, could contribute to the United States of America when they arrived here. And they could help address the imperfections that we had. all they wanted to do was fit into the country, and I think they made a real contribution to this country. And the country's stronger because they were here. And they benefited a lot. That was an era where there is no dispute about American leadership. After considerable American failure, because there was a period of time when these halls of Congress ignored the plight of the Jews in Europe and ignored that the Holocaust was going on. They knew it. They knew about the death camps, and there was nothing that they did about it until the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and then we entered the war. And we never looked back, and the world never looked back. We became the arsenal of democracy. We supplying England and Europe England and the Allies with the material it needed to fight the war. Our economy was growing substantially after the Great Depression, and as the arsenal of democracy, we built those weapons here. We manufactured those weapons here. We sent them over to the UK in particular for them to deploy on the battlefields of Europe, and we won that war. And the United States literally saved my grandparents' lives and my mother's life. And then after the war, the question was, what will be done with the rubble of Europe? What will be done with the communities and cities and towns and rural areas that literally were smashed into smithereens by Hitler's tanks? And we're now, in some ways, living in, not in some ways, but actually living in the tyranny of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain, without the freedoms that people had in Western Europe. And there's too much to talk about tonight, and I won't do it, but we engaged in a process of trying to win the peace after we had won the war. And that was what the Marshall Plan was all about, the reconstruction of Europe, the reconstruction of Japan, decisions that were made on this floor by human beings, in many ways just like us, who had the vision to make some hard decisions that would last for generations, the consequences of which would last for generations. And they had exactly the same concerns that we have here today, I think, probably. And they weren't able to predict the future, but they knew what it meant to be on the right side of history, and they were on the right side of history. The Marshall Plan began what was an era of institution building. They created the multilateral organizations that we still have, the rule of law, international law, the law of nations, the notion that any country's sovereignty shouldn't be attacked by another country. All of that came out of that era when my mom was a little girl, and it lasted for a long time in Europe. It lasted until 2 years ago when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine. You could argue that it lasted when he had a trial run when he invaded Crimea a decade before. Until that time, every country in Europe and around Europe had respected the international arrangements that were created in the wake of the rubble of World War II, because people knew how horrible the outcomes were in World War II. They knew how many lives had been lost. They knew how the destruction of humanity, the destruction of churches and synagogues, of people's faiths, entire religions and languages. People still had the memory of World War I, II, and that's what the point of those institutions. And that was the point of the commitment to the rule of law. And that was the point of establishing democracy in the international organizations that I'm talking about, but also in all these countries as well that were on this side of the Iron Curtain. And over time, over those decades, our economies grew stronger, the democracies grew stronger. Ultimately, the Berlin Wall fell, and there were people in the 1990s who were writing that this was the end of history, that liberal democracy had triumphed over any other form of human organization, that capitalism had triumphed over any other form of economic organization. We've learned a lot since then. We've learned a lot since then when we were attacked on 9/11 and the response that led us to 2 wars that lasted for 20 years in the Middle East. And then Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, of a free country on the border of Russia. The presiding officer is on the Intelligence Committee now. It is an excellent place to serve together. Before you got on there, it was really interesting to be there, not because you weren't there. It's gotten better because you've been there, but it was fascinating to be there in the lead up to this war, because we had the opportunity to see Putin make one mistake after another because of who he is, obviously, but also because of the totalitarian nature of his society. You know, when you live in a totalitarian society and you're the person at the top, nobody's going to tell you what you're doing is crazy if they want to live very long. Nobody's going to tell you that what you're trying to do is wrong. And I think one of the huge mistakes he made was imagining that all the money that he had spent on his army, trying to strengthen his army, had been spent well, when much of it was lost in corruption. Much of it created actually a weak army instead of a strong army. How do we know that today? We know that today because the Ukrainian people have basically smashed Putin's army. And let me tell you something, he didn't know that was going to happen. He did not know that was going to happen 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he had no idea that the Ukrainian people would fight to the death. He didn't know that. We did. That's actually our intelligence agencies sometimes make mistakes in their analysis of intelligence or in the intelligence that they collect, not on this subject, because they know the history of Ukraine, they know the history of the Ukrainian people, they know what they went through in World War II, they know what they went through in World War I, they know what they've been through in the last eon in that part of the world. And what they said was, they'll never give up. They'll never give up. Putin didn't know that. It turns out the intelligence community was right about that. They said, well, we hope that free societies around the world will rally to the cause. And I don't think that's really an intelligence assessment, the assessment of our democracies. There's been a lot of worry. I have had a lot of worry. I've talked about on this floor a lot about the state of democracy, both here and abroad. We're living at a time when there are all kinds of forces that are tearing at democracy, at here and abroad. And there are politicians here and abroad who are claiming that democracy is not important, or that democracy can't deliver for the American people or anybody else. That's not uncommon in human history. And the reason I think it's happening here, there's a bunch of reasons, but a main reason is kind of the age-old reason, which is when people start to lose a sense of opportunity for themselves and their families. When they're working really hard and they can't get ahead, when they feel like they can't afford to work because childcare is so expensive, healthcare is so expensive, higher education is going to mean a lifetime sentence in your parents' basement because of the amount of loans that you're going to take out. Those kinds of things tear at people. And when that kind of opportunity seems lost or obscure, that is when people show up all throughout human history and they say, I alone can fix it. You don't need a democracy. You don't need the rule of law. You should expect your public sector and your private sector to be hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly bankrupt. That is a dark vision. It's not an unusual vision in those circumstances. But just at the moment when we worried, we feared for our democracy, what we saw as a result of the courage, the bravery of the Ukrainian people, the skill of the Ukrainian soldiers and military, a country that I still don't understand, a country that was able to basically disable Putin's navy without any navy of their own and open up the shipping lanes in the Black Sea so people all over the world could benefit from grain that was otherwise not going to be exported. People all over the world in free countries saw this courage and said, we need to show up for the Ukrainian people. We need to do more for the Ukrainian people because they're in a fight that's our fight. And they are carrying off this fight in a way that they should be proud of and we should be proud of, that inspires us. And people all over the world, citizens living in democracies all over the world, called up their elected officials and said, do more, do more, do more. And the United States found itself once again in a position that no other country in the world can occupy, which is the leader of the free world, the leader of every democracy around the world. And we put together a coalition of countries, largely led by NATO, that has supported the Ukrainian people through this fight for the last 2 years. And it's been amazing to see it. I think it's given us confidence in our own democracy. I think it's given the Europeans confidence in their democracies, and democracies in Southeast Asia as well, and in Australia, New Zealand, and places all over the world that have supported this fight and been reminded how much more excellent it is to live in a free society, to live in a place that's committed to the rule of law, that's committed to fair dealing and not to corruption. That's not a place like where my poor mother and grandparents lived, where might made right, where there was no rule of law, where whether you survived or whether you didn't survive, whether you survived or whether you perished, was a matter of luck, not something you could ever predict. And that's been a noble fight. It's not a fight any of us would have wanted. But Putin is a lot weaker today than he was 2 years ago. The Russian army is a lot weaker today than it was 2 years ago. They're not a pushover. They have dangerous nuclear and chemical weapons that we have to worry about. But they are in worse shape today than they were 2 years ago. And the Ukrainian people have succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. I mentioned the intelligence agency reports. You know, one thing they got totally wrong was they thought they thought Kyiv would be invaded in 72 hours, that the political leadership would be killed or overcome. And President Zelensky is still there fighting to this day. I remember, Mr. President, when we had our first Zoom call with President Zelensky, which was sort of funny. It was back in, I think it was still COVID was going on maybe, and I can remember that there was a guy sitting in for him, just like on any regular Zoom call you would have, only he was sitting in for the president of Ukraine, and the president of Ukraine had some pretty serious business that he had to conduct. And finally, when the meeting was ready to be started, all of a sudden, there he was. There he was. And he said to us on that day, the first day that I ever heard him talk personally, it was on Zoom, and he said, "We're fighting to live our lives the way you live your lives." That's how he put it. It was very simple. That's what we're fighting for. And he hasn't changed that tune for the last 2 years. That's been his focus. He told us the other day that if we fail to continue to fund the Ukrainian people, that they'll lose. He said if we fund the Ukrainian people and their military, they can win. They can win. I think they can win. He said if we don't fund them, they'll lose. But he said, but we'll never stop fighting. We'll never stop fighting because the Ukrainian people love freedom. And that's the difference between us and Vladimir Putin. And that's the difference between us and the Russian army. I would say, how dare anybody bet against the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian people after what they've done? They've taken back half of the territory that Putin stole from them. Nobody would have said they could do that. They've done that. I mentioned what they'd done to his navy in the Black Sea without even a navy. They have won battle after battle after battle that nobody thought they would win, and now they are in a difficult winter on the front lines, in a sort of a stasis, which is not surprising. I've heard people out here say that that's somehow a failure for the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people. And it's hard for me to see how that's anything but a success, an extraordinary success. And we don't know what is going to happen after this winter when the next fighting season comes, but I would never bet against the Ukrainian people's ingenuity or their military's toughness or their society's resolve. I would never bet against freedom. I would never bet against democracy. That's the bet we have here. That's the choice that we have to make. It's a choice where our folks are not involved in the fighting. Our folks are not giving their lives in this fight, in this battle for democracy, but we are giving our treasure, we are giving our intelligence in this fight, because this fight is as important for us as it is for Ukraine. I don't mean that rhetorically, I mean that literally. When I hear the isolationist people in this chamber talking about their desire not to continue funding Ukraine, I want to say to them, and in fact, I do say to them, even if I accepted your premise, which I don't, but let's say I accept your isolationist premise that this is a moment in human history when we shouldn't support the Ukrainians because we've got things that we have to do at home instead of things that we have to do in Ukraine. Do you think that Putin will stop just because we decide to stop? Do you think Putin will just give up because we've given up? Do you think that the war will just come to an end? Or do you think that Putin will roll back through the territory that the Ukrainians have seized from his army? Do you think that Putin will block the grain shipments in the Black Sea that are so important to feeding people around the world and stopping famine around the world? Do you think that he will threaten Eastern Europe? Do you think that he will never give up? And if you believe that, and the odds are not even 50-50 that that stuff's true. It's 100% what's going to happen. If you believe that, and you are an isolationist, you should be for continuing this funding because we want to keep our people out of this fight. And because it's given us the opportunity to rebuild our military and our defense. That is not a small thing, Mr. President. 90% of the money that we've sent to Ukraine has been spent here, rearming the United States, restarting factories and supply chain lines that we're going to need to project strength throughout the world. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. That is what Ronald Reagan meant when he said peace through strength. That's what he meant when he went up to and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, because you can't bottle up the human spirit, and because your economy is getting crushed because you can't outcompete the U.S. in terms of our expenditures. We're in exactly the same position today. I really believe this, Mr. President, that the Ukrainian people can win on this battlefield. And that's not just from casually reading the newspapers, that's from being a member of the Intelligence Committee. That's seeing the intelligence that you're seeing. I don't know if they will win. I believe they can win. I think they have a chance to win. I think Putin thinks he could lose. On that battlefield, he thinks he could lose. And the battlefield he's counting on winning on is the battlefield of Capitol Hill, the battlefield of Western democracies. You don't have to take my word for it. He says it almost every day. He says they're going to lose patience. He says their attention span is too short. It doesn't help that there are some American politicians, including a former president, who seem to be rooting for his success, who seem to be rooting against the Ukrainian people, who seem to be rooting against democracy. That certainly doesn't help. But even if you don't accept that, there's a reason that he believes that, because it's hard to sustain these efforts in a democracy. He doesn't have the inconvenience of a democracy. He has a totalitarian society that can do will do what he says it's going to do. And we have a democracy where people stand for election, where sometimes people might say 2 years is enough, or a stalemate on the front lines isn't good enough, or we have too much to do here to spend just a little bit more money to re-equip our defense capabilities as well as to support Ukraine. He's counting on that. He's counting on winning on this battlefield. He's counting on the fact that there have been some elections in Europe where there are people that have been elected that have the same sort of isolationist temperament that some people have here. We can't let that happen. We cannot let that happen. And Mr. President, you were there when I first addressed our caucus on this question. For me, this is personal. I didn't go through it. Obviously, I didn't go through it, what my mother went through. But nobody can escape history, and I think no one can escape history. And it's really important for us to learn history. It's really important for us to understand the stakes at this moment and what it looks like to be invisible to this chamber, to be fighting on that freezing front line and not know whether we're going to come through with the ammunition, to be suffering through another cold snap when your heat's been blown up by the Russians and not knowing whether the humanitarian aid is going to come, to be a politician in some Western European capital and wondering whether the United States is going to continue to provide the exquisite and capable leadership that has been provided by this nation in a bipartisan way over the last 2 years. Those are the things that are at stake as we're meeting here tonight. And in the course of human events, it is really easy to lose patience. It's really easy to have a short attention span, certainly a shorter attention span than a dictator who's acting out the imperialist impulses of Peter the Great, which Putin is, or who's going to be there whether we leave or whether we don't leave on the border of Ukraine for the rest of his life, one way or another, and he thinks, for the rest of Russia's existence, because that's how he thinks. So I'm not here to say, we're going to, that we're going to end the Russian ambition for Ukraine, but I'm here to say we have a chance to win this battle for democracy, for us and for Ukraine. And we should. If somebody had set out 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago to say, let's have a plan to spend 5% of the DoD budget, restart our defense capabilities in the United States of America, expose the weakness of Putin's army, make Xi Jinping have to think once or twice or 3 times or 4 times about the advisability of invading Taiwan because of the chance that free countries around the world would all come together in support of a country that had been invaded. If we had said, please give us a strategy for that, the amount of money that we've spent and for the $60 billion that's in, or the $90 billion that's in this request, there is no way we would have been as successful as the Ukrainians have been. So this is an easy choice, I think, for us to make. It's a very important choice for us to make. We cannot allow Putin to win on our dysfunctional battlefield. I'm going to finish, Mr. President, just by observing that there are colleagues here who have said that they don't want to support this effort unless we deal with the situation at the border and unless we deal with immigration as part of this. By the way, I would mention that one of those people is not the leader of the Republican caucus, Mitch McConnell. I don't think there's anyone in America who believes more fiercely in the duty the American people have and this Congress as a representative of the American people to fund Ukraine than Senator McConnell. And I want to say that. I want to thank him for his steadfastness because it's made a difference so far, and I think it will make a difference if we can get this over the finish line. But there are some colleagues on the other side who said they are unwilling to give their votes here unless we address the border. I would not have attached immigration to this debate. This debate's hard enough without introducing another issue that we've had so much difficulty grappling with. But I think what we have discovered in the course of this discussion, Mr. President, and something that the presiding officer has made clear as a senator from a border state, the American people do not want our border policy dictated by transnational gangs. The American people do not want decisions made by smuggling enterprises that are violating people's human rights, that are dragging people all over the globe to come to the southern border of the United States. The American people want to make the decisions for our border and for our immigration policy. And the president has said that our border is broken. The Secretary of Homeland Security has said that our border is broken. I spent 2 days, Mr. President, in the Tucson sector on the border, and it needs a lot of work. And it probably needs changes of policy and money. There's a reason why President Biden put $14 billion in the supplemental for the border. That's more money than is in the supplemental for Israel. So I would not have attached this to the Ukraine deal, but I understand the motivations of people that have attached it. And I believe that we can carry out a negotiation on this topic that helps improve our border and improve our immigration system on behalf of the American people. We have a lot more that we need to do on immigration than we're going to be able to do in this negotiation. And as part of the Gang of Eight who passed the last comprehensive immigration bill to pass the U.S. Senate, that got 68 votes, that had a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people that are undocumented in this country, that had the most progressive DREAM Act that any Congress anybody had ever written, much less passed in the Senate, that had all of the visa issues that are so important to our universities, to our businesses, to our farmers and ranches, to our farm workers, to our ski resorts, to all of that. The border security, $40 billion of border security in that bill, Mr. President, that would have allowed us to see every inch of the border. We're a long way from getting to those policy issues, but I hope that this debate and discussion will lead to more bipartisan cooperation in the coming years, months and years, to remind us that something that I think we've forgotten for the moment, which is that immigration is an incredible strength of the United States of America. We have many headwinds in this country. The lack of quality of our education system, especially for kids living in poverty. Our health care system, which costs twice as much as any other industrialized country in the world. We have to fix those. Our massive income inequality, we have to fix that. All of those things would strengthen our democracy. And we have to fix our immigration system. Immigration has been responsible for literally a third of our economic growth throughout our entire history. Immigration is how we get new talent and new ideas. Immigration is how my mom and her parents came to this country. Immigration is a dynamic force for good that countries like China don't have the benefit of. There's nobody crossing the Gobi Desert to get to Beijing. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. It's because they want the same thing that President Zelensky wants. It's because they want the same thing that the Ukrainian people want. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the opportunity to lend their talents to improving the society in which they live. no matter where they come from, no matter what language they speak, no matter what religion they have, for the benefit of their children, and to know that their children are protected from political violence. Because we have a democratic way of resolving our differences and resolving our disputes. We live at a moment, Mr. President, where there's a lot of sort of monopoly on wisdom and cable television stations at night that are telling you there's only one way to think about any issue, like immigration or like Ukraine, when that's not actually the way this is supposed to work. The founders of this country did not create this country thinking we would agree with each other. It was the opposite. They knew what a society was where everybody agreed with each other. That was a society where there was a tyrant in charge to tell you what to think, to tell you what to believe, like Putin's Russia, like Xi's China, like Iran, like North Korea. They knew exactly what those places were like. They knew that that humans have lots of different experiences and attitudes, but they knew that in a society that was run by a tyrant, you weren't free to express those. Here, they thought the genius of what they were setting up would be a result of the disagreements we have, not the agreements that we have. They thought out of those disagreements, like on this Senate floor, that we would create more imaginative and more durable results than any king or tyrant could ever come up with on their own. That was the idea. And I'd say to the pages that are here, this may sound like some big philosophical thing, but I'll bet the same thing is true for you. The worst decisions I make are the decisions I make at home, alone, in my basement, not consulting with someone else's point of view, not consulting with someone else's experience or perspective. That's why there are 100 members of the Senate, two from every state, so that we can have that disagreement and we can have that discussion. And that's why people want to come to this country, because they know how rare that is in human societies. And that's why Ukraine is leading this fight on behalf of the rest of us, and why they will never give up. I say again, President Zelensky was clear when he came here. He said that with your help, we can win. Without your help, we will lose. But even if you don't help us, we're not going to give up, because the Ukrainian people love freedom, and we are going to continue to fight for freedom. So, Mr. President, I mentioned at the beginning of this speech that I was lifting my hold on the FAA because I felt like even though I'm deeply disappointed that we haven't passed this Ukraine funding and we haven't come yet to an agreement, I think we've made progress in the negotiations. And I had the chance to consult with both the majority leader and the Republican leader, and I know they put out a joint statement tonight saying that we had made progress and saying that they were committed to having the Senate move quickly, and I hope decisively, in January on this issue. And I think that's the best we're going to get out of this tonight. And I hope it gives us the chance over the next few weeks, Mr. President, for all of us to consider the example of people that have come before us, who have served in this chamber, who themselves had no monopoly on wisdom, people who were fallible, but who took a risk on the future and understood that nobody else can play the role the United States of America can play. That was true on the way into World War II, that was true on the way out of World War II, and it is just as true today. I have found it amazing, Mr. President, when we've been in the company of President Zelensky, because you feel like you're in the company of the Ukrainian people. You feel like you're in the company of the Ukrainian soldiers for the reasons that I said earlier about why he's in this fight. But it's an amazing thing about human events that 3 years ago he was a television star of some kind or other, and today he's the president of a country that has been attacked by a tyrant, invaded by a tyrant. And he's not a tall guy, he's not a strong guy. And the literal weight of the world is on his shoulders. And the literal weight of the world is on the Ukrainian people's shoulders, and it's on their military shoulders. And we can help lift that burden from them. We can't take that burden away from them, nor should we. They're the ones that are fighting on the front line, and they will be. But we should help lift that burden from them, because their burden is our burden, and because nobody else on this planet is situated in the same way as the United States, has the same moral responsibility that we have, and has the capability to lend the kind of support we can lend. And because the Ukrainian people have shown up and done their job, it's time for us to show up and do our job. And in January, let's tell Vladimir Putin that he lost the battle on this battlefield, and that he's going to lose the battle in Ukraine as well. Mr. President, I just want to thank the floor staff tonight for enduring this, the pages for enduring this. I want to thank you for all of your work during this entire year, and wish everybody a happy holidays. Mr. President, I yield the floor.